In an unprecedented move, Zara Tindall, granddaughter of the late Queen Elizabeth, has broken her silence. And her words cut deeper than anyone could have imagined. "My mum would be proud of Catherine, not Camilla." This wasn't a passing comment. It was a warning and a declaration of loyalty that stunned the monarchy from within. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The recording was never meant to be public. Captured during what was believed to be a private family conversation at Gotcombe Park, Zara's words found their way into the hands of a trusted aide, who in turn leaked them. The timing was no accident. The audio hit the press just as top royal advisors convened to discuss the monarchy's next phase amid Charles's extended silence. Tensions were already running high, but this changed everything. Because it wasn't just a critique, it was a dividing line, and it came from within the bloodline itself. Zara's connection to her mother, Princess Anne, is legendary. Quiet strength, unwavering principle, and a sense of duty above self, traits both women have embodied. And so when Zara referenced her mother in contrast to Camilla, she wasn't simply expressing an opinion. She was invoking legacy. That subtle implication that Camilla has strayed from the example Princess Anne upheld was enough to send the royal court into panic. For Catherine, however, it was something else entirely. According to insiders, she was visibly moved when told of Zara's words, reportedly whispering, "She said that?" through tears. After weeks of mounting pressure and whispered resentment, it was the first public sign of a solid alliance behind her. But while the quote lit fires of admiration for some, others saw red. Camilla's circle reportedly went into immediate damage control, with statements drafted and surrogates briefed to spin the narrative. But the damage was already done. The quote was raw, real, and deeply personal. Attempts to neutralize its power only fed the storm. Because for the public, the line struck a nerve. To many, Zara voiced what had gone unsaid for years. To others, she crossed a sacred line criticizing a reigning queen consort. Social media fractured instantly. Some praised Zara for her honesty, calling her the voice of the late queen's spirit. Others accused her of undermining royal unity at a time of national uncertainty. The divide was immediate, passionate, and visible across headlines, forums, and broadcasts. But regardless of allegiance, no one could deny what this meant. A senior royal one not shackled by titles or obligations had spoken, and the implications were seismic. Because this wasn't just about loyalty, it was about lineage, legacy, and a family breaking from within. Zara may be without title, but she's never been without purpose. Raised in the shadow of duty, her worldview was forged not in palaces but on horseback, under her mother's unrelenting expectations. And now, she speaks not just as a daughter, but as a witness. For years, the relationship between Princess Anne and Camilla was the royal family's most underreported Cold War. Beneath the curtsies and photo ops lay a mutual mistrust impossible to disguise behind protocol. Anne, stoic and unflinching in her understanding of monarchy, saw Camilla not as a threat, but as a deviation, a softening of standards, a deviation from the firm, principled example the Queen had upheld. It was not about rivalry, it was about reverence. And Zara, who lived not behind palace gates but under her mother's direct influence, absorbed every unspoken lesson with the quiet intensity of someone who had seen both privilege and discipline from the inside out. Zara's upbringing was defined by expectation, not entitlement. Anne had deliberately shielded her from the pressures of royal life, choosing instead to ground her in sport, resilience, and silence. But that silence carried a code, one that did not need to be written down to be understood. Camilla, in that unspoken world, was tolerated but never fully trusted. And Zara, fiercely loyal to her mother's values, carried that wariness into adulthood. The love she developed for Catherine wasn't born from public appearances. It came from behind the scenes, shared conversations, small gestures, and a shared sense of unease around Camilla's growing influence. From the beginning, Zara saw something familiar in Catherine. The same willingness to serve without complaint. The same burden of being judged, scrutinized, and held to impossible standards. As Catherine was quietly molded by the monarchy, Zara watched, sometimes silently, sometimes protectively, as whispers turned into headlines, and private struggles became national conversations. And through it all, her loyalty hardened. She didn't see Catherine as just a princess. She saw her as the kind of woman Anne would have respected: grit over glamour, devotion over display. The Tindalls have always straddled two worlds, public enough to represent, private enough to preserve their own code. Zara was never groomed for power, but she was steeped in perspective. She didn't need a title to understand what it means to carry the family's legacy. And when she spoke, when she invoked her mother's pride in Catherine, it wasn't rebellion. It was revelation. It was the voice of a royal raised outside the noise, now choosing to step into it. And Anne, characteristically silent, made no public statement. But sources close to the palace say her quiet smile behind closed doors said more than words ever could. But the storm behind Zara's words wasn't new. Its roots stretch back to a battle that began long before Charles ever wore the crown. Behind every crown lies compromise, and no royal compromise was more controversial than Camilla's ascent. Whispers of betrayal, rewrites of history, and a long campaign for public acceptance. But behind the polished exterior, old wounds never healed. The war began in shadows, private moments behind heavy doors, when truth clashed with duty. In the turbulent years of Charles and Diana's unraveling, Princess Anne stood as both witness and silent combatant. She had no tolerance for duplicity, no patience for drama. And Camilla, to Anne, wasn't merely a mistress, she was the embodiment of everything that threatened to collapse the institution from within. Rumors swirled of blistering confrontations, of Anne's disdain slicing through pretense in rooms where royal blood ran cold. While Charles begged for space to love freely, Anne reminded him what monarchy demanded: sacrifice, not sentiment. But Camilla was never naive. She understood that power came not through rebellion, but reinvention. Over years, then decades, she reshaped her image. No longer the villainous interloper, she became the dutiful consort, the grandmotherly figure softened by time. Public relations became palace policy. Tabloid attacks gave way to strategic visibility. Hand in hand with Charles, she stood not as the woman who divided, but the one who endured. Yet in the quiet corners of Windsor, not everyone forgot. Not everyone forgave. Zara grew up watching this transformation unfold, piece by curated piece. And she watched her mother's silence as a signal. Anne didn't need to condemn. Her refusal to dine when Camilla was present, her decision to avoid joint appearances, her cold nods in public settings, those were her statements. Zara noticed. She saw how lines were drawn, not on paper, but in posture. The tension was never spoken aloud, but it hovered in the air, thick, unmistakable, unresolved. The divide between the Spencer legacy and the Parker Bowles lineage was not just familial, it was symbolic. Diana's memory loomed large, not only in public hearts but in the quiet convictions of those closest to her. Anne never uttered her allegiance, but she didn't need to. Zara inherited it, not as a grudge but as a guiding lens. She was shaped by truth, not spin. And in her heart, loyalty was measured not by proximity to power, but by the values that defined it. As Camilla's status grew, so did the gap between perception and reality. Acceptance may have been engineered, but reverence couldn't be. And in this stark contrast lay the seeds of the current reckoning. A monarchy divided not by enemies, but by choices. One woman embraced by history, another rewritten into it. And Zara, forged in the heart of that division, finally broke her silence, not just to choose a side, but to remind the world that legacy cannot be manufactured. And while Camilla slowly gained acceptance, Catherine quietly earned devotion, and that difference now fuels a royal reckoning. She wasn't born royal. She didn't demand power. But Catherine, Princess of Wales, now commands more than attention, she commands hearts. And it's that quiet strength that's won her allies in unexpected corners of the palace. At first, Catherine and Zara were acquaintances bound by formality, sharing the occasional smile at royal engagements, exchanging small talk under the watchful gaze of tradition. But what began as civility gradually evolved into something deeper, anchored not in title or spectacle, but in shared values. Motherhood, integrity, loyalty, these weren't just talking points. They were the silent rhythms of their daily lives. For Zara, who grew up under the tough, unsentimental eye of Princess Anne, it wasn't opulence or rank that earned respect. It was grit. And Catherine, through her quiet constancy, proved time and again that she possessed it in abundance. As King Charles's health waned, it was Catherine, not Camilla, who emerged as the unseen pillar behind palace doors. She didn't seek visibility, but the weight of duty found her nonetheless. Weekly updates, private briefings, stabilizing the family image in public, she took it all on without complaint. While headlines speculated over succession, Catherine was already holding the threads of the monarchy together. Staff who once drew strict lines between the Queen Consort and the Princess of Wales began to whisper of a new hierarchy, not defined by protocol, but by presence. And in that shifting dynamic, admiration began to swell not just from the nation, but from those within the firm. Zara watched closely. She saw Catherine hold space for others without demanding it for herself. When her own children raised outside the royal bubble needed guidance or grounding in tradition, it was Catherine who quietly offered support. Birthday cards arrived without fanfare. Private invitations extended to avoid the press. Gestures, small in size but immense in meaning. These were the things that mattered. And to a woman raised to value authenticity over appearance, Catherine's actions spoke volumes. Rumors soon trickled from behind closed doors, whispers that Anne had spoken up during royal briefings, quietly endorsing Catherine's role in the future of the crown. It wasn't a proclamation, but a nod of trust from a woman whose approval was neither easily earned nor lightly given. And for Zara, that silent endorsement carried weight. Because Anne did not invest in pageantry, she invested in people. And when she leaned toward Catherine, Zara followed. The admiration that bloomed between the two women became more than mutual respect, it became kinship, bound by legacy, refined through experience, and cemented by resilience. But in a palace where power is currency and alignment is strategy, such a bond was bound to spark conflict. Because the deeper Catherine stepped into the light, the more others scrambled to cast a shadow. But admiration turned to defense when internal divisions threatened the very role Catherine was born by marriage to carry. While the cameras focused on public appearances, a hidden war brewed within Balmoral's private halls. Allegiances were questioned, roles were challenged, and at the heart of it, two women, Camilla and Catherine, stood on opposite sides of the same throne. Behind the grandeur of official statements and well-placed smiles, something more volatile stirred. It began with whispers, late-night conversations between Anne, Zara, and a tight circle of senior aides who no longer trusted the natural order. Camilla, it was said, had grown bolder. Her appearances were becoming more frequent, her staff more assertive. She was no longer satisfied with ceremonial duties. She wanted control, real control. And as Charles's health began to falter, the space between duty and ambition narrowed. Camilla didn't hesitate to step in. But in doing so, she stepped on nerves that were already frayed. Senior courtiers began to notice a shift, small, strategic changes in the flow of information, in who received updates, and in whose voice was being heard in meetings. And still, Charles said nothing. Whether it was intentional silence or the exhaustion of a man losing grip on both body and institution, no one knew. But what was clear is that the absence of clarity created a vacuum, and both women were being pulled into it. For Camilla, it meant asserting herself. For Catherine, it meant defending what was being slowly stripped from under her feet. Zara, sensing the winds changing, issued a quiet warning. "There are whispers in the West Wing," she said to Catherine during a private moment. "And they're not all kind." Catherine didn't flinch. She never did. But behind her calm exterior, the message landed with weight. She knew what it meant. Camilla was no longer working in parallel, she was working against. Internal memos, some later leaked, used phrases like dueling queens and unclear lines of command. They weren't just metaphors. They were reflections of a palace in quiet chaos. William, caught between blood and marriage, felt the full brunt of the conflict. Those close to him described a man deeply conflicted, pulled between preserving his mother's legacy and defending the woman he loves. Publicly, he remained composed. Privately, he was said to be losing sleep. The unity he'd worked so hard to preserve with his father's wife was cracking, and now it was his own family in the crossfire. Catherine remained outwardly serene, but inside, the pressure built with every meeting Camilla commandeered, every headline that began to subtly reframe the hierarchy. And just when the tensions could rise no further, Zara dropped the line that shattered the illusion of unity. The quote didn't come from a press release. It wasn't planned. It slipped intentionally or otherwise and ignited a palace meltdown. But who leaked it? And why? The answer may expose a plot far deeper than anyone realized. The timeline was the first clue. Zara's words surfaced less than an hour after a tightly guarded palace briefing one that only a small circle of aides had attended. That coincidence was too precise to ignore. Investigators inside the Royal Communications Office began tracing digital trails, matching timestamps to call logs, message drafts, and off-the-record conversations. The leak didn't travel far. It traveled fast, which meant it came from someone already positioned close to the narrative's nerve center. And with every passing minute, suspicion drifted toward a group few dared to accuse outright. Courtiers known to be quietly aligned with Catherine. Those closest to the Princess of Wales had reason to believe the moment was ripe. The palace was divided. Public sentiment was fragile, and Zara's statement, raw and unscripted, had the power to crystallize a side without Catherine ever having to say a word. But was that the plan? Or was Zara herself caught in a game she didn't design? Her reaction, according to those present when the leak broke, was not triumph but disbelief. She reportedly asked, "How did it get out?" Not once. Twice. The room went silent. Was it genuine shock or careful performance? In a palace where every expression can be read two ways, even surprise can be strategic. Camilla's team didn't waste time. By nightfall, they demanded a formal investigation. Phones were checked. Laptops were logged. Long-serving aides were questioned with a severity usually reserved for national security breaches. To them, this wasn't gossip. It was sabotage. The quote wasn't just critical. It was symbolic. It suggested a hierarchy of virtue inside the royal family and placed Camilla beneath Catherine in the moral order of legacy. For a woman who had spent decades reshaping her image, that cut deeper than any headline. Then came the private messages. Snippets of communication between Zara and Princess Anne surfaced, nothing explicit, nothing incriminating, but revealing in tone. Words like "stand firm" and "truth matters" were enough to spark a new theory, that Zara had been encouraged to speak, not to attack, but to anchor a value system that felt under siege. An anonymous source added fuel to the fire with a single line that spread through newsrooms like wildfire: Zara was pushed, not reckless. It suggested the leak was not a mistake, but a release timed, targeted, and meant to test the waters of public reaction. As the palace scrambled to contain the fallout, the real consequence became clear. The leak had done more than expose a quote. It exposed fault lines. It showed who stood where when pressure arrived. And it forced every senior royal to choose between silence and alignment. In that chaos, the loudest voice was not the one making accusations. It was the one refusing to respond at all. But as the dust swirled and headlines blared, one voice remained remarkably steady: Catherine's. No denial. No rebuttal. Just a simple statement of values, one that didn't mention Camilla, but left no doubt who Catherine was standing with. Her response wasn't loud. It was lethal. When Catherine emerged with a composed grace and addressed the nation not through confrontation, but through conviction, it sent shockwaves louder than any direct attack could have. Her speech was framed around honor, legacy, and truth. Words that seemed, on the surface, harmless. But the palace knew better. The timing was surgical. The tone was unmistakable. And the absence of Camilla's name said more than an entire dossier could. Within hours, headlines didn't need to speculate, they proclaimed, "Catherine has spoken." The public response was immediate. Visceral. Catherine's message, laced with subtle yet searing undertones, was widely perceived as an elegant affirmation of Zara's words. In fact, it was more than that. It was a declaration of moral alignment. She didn't need to echo Zara's exact statement. She stood beside its spirit, validating it in full view of the nation. Camilla's camp called it inflammatory without being direct, a branding that only fueled the fire. To Catherine's supporters, it was strength. To her critics, it was precision warfare disguised in silk. But inside the palace, the consequences grew heavier by the minute. During a joint appearance just days later, body language became headline material. William stood beside his wife, but the usual warmth was absent, his gaze distant, his hand never reaching for hers. Those who had long whispered about William's burden now saw a prince caught in an impossible tension. Behind palace doors, rumors swirled that Catherine had sought counsel from Princess Anne herself. The quiet matriarch, who rarely interfered in the emotional affairs of others, reportedly told Catherine, "Let character speak louder than rank." And that's precisely what Catherine had done. But it wasn't just internal favor she'd secured. Public polls revealed a staggering shift support for Catherine surged, eclipsing even the carefully constructed image of Camilla. For every accusation of veiled hostility, there were 10 expressions of admiration for Catherine's restraint. She had drawn a line in the sand without lifting a weapon. And in doing so, she forced the monarchy to reckon with the emotional truths simmering beneath its gilded surface. Yet the ripple wasn't over. That speech, elegant and composed, did more than affirm a bond. It unsettled the very structure of palace politics. The royals had always depended on coded silence and buried feuds. But now, the code had been broken. Not by a scandalous leak or a rebellious outburst, but by a speech that chose values over titles. But as power shifts and public tides rise, the real battle may not be between queens but between blood and bond. What would the queen think? The question echoes through every corridor, every whisper, every decision. And in Zara's mind, there is no doubt her grandmother would have chosen legacy over image, Catherine over Camilla. As the palace faces an emotional firestorm, the shadow of Queen Elizabeth II looms larger than ever. She may be gone, but her presence, her principles refuse to fade. In the aftermath of Zara's words, insiders have begun quietly re-examining the Queen's final public gestures. And what emerges is not neutrality, but intention. In her final years, Elizabeth was more calculated than the world realized, especially in matters of image, loyalty, and future legacy. Her repeated public alignment with Catherine, whether in small gestures or formal appearances, now carries a retrospective weight. It wasn't just protocol, it was preparation. The Queen knew how fragile the monarchy's hold on public favor had become. She had lived through scandals, divorces, betrayals. She understood better than anyone that image could crumble but values endure. And in Catherine, she saw an embodiment of that quiet endurance. There was no need to whisper her disapproval of Camilla. Her silence spoke volumes. While she publicly accepted Charles's consort, her warmth, her spontaneous affection was more freely given to Catherine. Even Zara, as a child, had noticed it. The way her grandmother would pause a little longer to speak to Catherine. The way her eyes softened when watching her with the children. It was never about titles. It was always about character. Privately, the Queen and Zara shared moments of candor. Late summer afternoons at Balmoral, quiet walks, intimate teas where the monarch dropped her veil of formality. Elizabeth spoke of service as the highest calling, not entitlement. She admired strength forged through duty, not ambition. And when asked, in one particularly telling moment, who would carry the spirit of the crown into the next era, not the weight, but the spirit, her response was brief and telling. "She listens before she leads," the Queen had said. Zara never forgot that. Recently, a handful of private letters exchanged between Elizabeth and a trusted advisor have begun to surface from within the Windsor archives. Though not damning, they hint at hesitation. One letter notes the difficulty in aligning Camilla's public role with the institution's traditional standards. Another highlights the Queen's concern about how modern sentimentality was reshaping the monarchy's priorities. She stopped short of naming names, but the implication was clear: there was unease. Now, in the light of Zara's explosive remark, these letters are being quietly circulated in elite circles as validation. Not as gossip, but as legacy. For Zara, it's never been about causing division. It's been about defending a vision. A vision passed down by the woman who shaped her, who led with quiet resolve, and who believed that strength must be rooted in humility. Her comment wasn't reckless, it was ancestral. A statement not just of personal preference, but of fidelity to the Queen's ideals. And those who knew Elizabeth best, who truly understood her quiet language, now believe one thing with certainty. If Elizabeth were alive today, she would not have scolded Zara. She would have nodded in knowing silence. And so, with the past whispering through history and the present ablaze with conflict, one question remains: what comes next? The royal family is no stranger to division. But this moment is different. This isn't about scandal or protocol, it's about identity. And with Zara, Catherine, and Anne aligned, the monarchy stands at a crossroads it cannot ignore. The aftershocks of Zara Tindall's statement have not faded, they've grown louder, echoing through palace chambers and public discourse alike. Within days, whispers of consequence began circling Camilla. Not official reprimands, not yet, but a quiet withdrawal of deference. Invitations rescinded. Engagements scaled down. Behind closed doors, even allies began to murmur what once would have been unthinkable. Is it time to reconsider Camilla's role? Not out of malice, but necessity. The public had drawn a line, and Catherine was firmly on the right side of it. In the wake of the storm, Catherine didn't campaign or posture. She didn't need to. The people rallied behind her, not just out of sympathy, but belief. A belief that she embodied what the monarchy should be in this century. Poised, present, and principled. Commentators, former staffers, even MPs began calling quietly, then openly for her to take on more. More appearances. More responsibility. More leadership. It wasn't just a plea for a princess, it was a plea for purpose. And in that rising tide of support, Zara emerged not just as a granddaughter of a queen, but as a voice of clarity in a fog of tradition. Her words pierced through the royal fog. She had no crown, no throne, no ambition. But what she had, what she wielded, was trust. The kind of influence not granted by decree, but earned through authenticity. And that made her the most dangerous kind of truth-teller. Caught between these towering forces was William, the son of a future king, the husband of a future queen. But more than that, a man torn between duty and love, legacy and transformation. Those close to him said he was shaken, visibly moved not only by Catherine's quiet resolve, but by the power of the women around him. His sister-in-law, his aunt, his mother-in-law in memory. The male dominance of the royal structure was being eclipsed, not by rebellion, but by something far more enduring: evolution. Princess Anne's legacy, once the silent thread of service running through the tapestry of the crown, now echoed thunderously through her daughter. Zara had inherited more than blood, she had inherited instinct. And with Catherine and Anne beside her, she wasn't just challenging Camilla, she was redefining what royalty could be. Not spectacle, not entitlement, but stewardship. And so, what began as a whispered remark became something more. A reckoning. A rebirth. The monarchy, bruised but not broken, now stands before a choice. Cling to the old guards of image, or embrace the rising call of service, truth, and female strength. Because Zara's words weren't just personal. They were prophetic. And the crown may never be worn the same way again. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.